Previously on Nameless Seraphim Gaming. Most types of terrain are identified only by symbol, and I've played many games where one or both players have forgotten to account for them. I likewise strongly disagree with Monolith's stance on rock terrain pieces removed from subsequent releases of the game amid complaints of their usability, as it created a visible barrier to line of sight that greatly aided the teaching of this key mechanic to players less familiar with similar games. Wow, that review feels like a long time ago. I must admit that when I made that throwaway line, I hadn't really considered its full implications, and I think it's worth further discussion, my views having developed a little since those heady days before Nameless Seraphim Gaming had even launched. Allow me to open the prosecution with a small history lesson for those that may be new to the Mythic Battles party. This video is going to be a bit of a rant, by the way, sorry about that. The original release of Mythic Battles Pantheon included among its wide range of miniatures several terrain elements that could be used both to add texture to an otherwise flat board and to represent certain mechanics in the game. As veterans of the game will know, there are few pleasures greater than hurling a tree or a ruined column at one of your opponent's miniatures, from a rules mechanic perspective, not literally, you understand. However, that first release also included a sort of cardboard box thing to represent the rocks, and well, let's just say they weren't the best. Travel through time to the version 1.5 update and reprint Kickstarter, and this cardboard structure had been removed from the game entirely. In the notes about the changes made to the 1.5 release of the game, Monolith stated,
"Both rocks have been removed. Indeed, it turns out that players had a lot of trouble assembling them, and they hindered the readability on the board and sometimes obscured some miniatures. In addition, during our editing of the rules, we reviewed our wording and realised that only trees and columns are considered 3D elements, which obey specific rules. So, the rock's placement is static, immovable, and the 3D pieces were merely an attempt to add dimension to the board."
At the risk of paraphrasing Monolith, my reading of this is that, perhaps in part influenced by the negative feedback received about the rock terrain, reactions to which in my experience range from utter confusion to mild bemusement, the company has concluded that players only need a physical terrain piece for 3D elements that can interact with the force of nature talent. Ruins and forests essentially act as counters to show whether these terrain types have been cleared by this talent. At first glance, this argument has some merit. Rocks don't move or get thrown around, they are a terrain type, but their state on the board is permanent. The reason I feel increasingly strongly that they should be represented on the board, however, is the result of their interaction with the visibility rule. A quick refresh of how this rule works. Models always have visibility of adjacent spaces. By extension, models can see out of terrain that blocks line of sight, and can be seen by models looking in, but crucially, a model cannot target another unit if there is an area containing visibility blocking terrain, known as obstacles, between its area and the target area. This is determined by drawing an imaginary line between the terrain icons in each area, and seeing what areas intersect it. In this way, models can hide behind rocks or on the other side of forests during gameplay. Rock terrain is not the only obstacle terrain type in Mythic Battles. It's probably the one you'll encounter most, being present on many different types of board, and in particular on the Olympus in Ruins board, probably the board on which many of us played out our first few games. However, other types include ruins, cliffs, and Tartarus cages. So imagine the scene from our last Mythic Battles playthrough. Hector is charging towards the Infernal Warriors, looking to lay his hands on the final Omphalos shard, and with it, victory. Achilles is far from the fight, but in his hand he holds an Omphalos, and with the discard of 2 Art of War cards, he invokes the power of Zeus. Lightning spills from his hands, striking out at the Trojan prince. A tense moment and a ridiculous dice roll later, Hector has suffered a mighty blow, his vitality almost spent, and victory surely snuffed from his grasp. "Wait a minute, Victor," I hear you cry. "We watched that video. It was awesome, by the way. But that never happened. There were no lightning bolts thrown in finding your form." No, there weren't. Because months after filming the playthrough, long into the editing process, we noticed a mistake had been made. Achilles had used the lightning power at a moment when his line of sight to Hector was in fact blocked by this Tartarus cage. For the channel, this mistake was costly, as we couldn't very well leave it like that, such a pivotal moment in the game that just shouldn't have happened. But even if this had been a casual game among friends, imagine realising after the game was over that the most memorable moment in your scenario was impossible. And the obvious counter-argument here is, well then don't forget about obstacles. But to be clear, everyone involved in that playthrough has been playing Mythic Battles Pantheon since its first release, and all of us missed this. Even though it was such a gigantic moment, with such a pivotal impact on the game, we didn't spot the problem. Because as obvious as it seems with hindsight, a flat illustration of a terrain piece is simply not enough to trigger the thought, can I see around this, mid-battle? The Tartarus map is, I think, a really interesting board to consider as there's so much going on amongst its atmospheric artwork. Not just the cages, but the chain barriers affecting movement, rock terrain, Tartarus cage walls that only troops and heroes can pass through. Additionally, like all the Mythic Battles maps, it's a very beautiful but also very noisy board. It may seem obvious that the big Tartarus cage illustrated on the map is there, but there are two other cages illustrated on the map which count as open ground. Likewise, not everything that looks like a chain on the board is actually a chain barrier. I've always thought of Mythic Battles as a game that is complicated enough, by which I mean its rule set is clear and after a few playthroughs most players really do get the hang of it, but even so there's a lot to keep in your head during gameplay. I genuinely believe that forgetting terrain effects in this way spoils the game for both players, as there is often no fair way to roll back the mistake. Monolith's argument that ruins and trees occupy a unique status in this regard strikes me as a little semantic. Most models in the game don't have force of nature, but there is still value to having this terrain on the board. I played a game of Mythic Battles with my children recently, and we couldn't be bothered to put out the ruined columns on the map as none of us had force of nature. No big deal, or so we thought, but I personally forgot the ruins were there on 4 separate occasions during the game as a result, something I have never done when the columns are physically present. Both I and my opponents lost out on additional defence as a result of that mistake, and I won't pretend that it completely stopped the game from being fun, but it was definitely hugely frustrating. Additionally, Monolith's argument that such terrain obscures visibility of the board, preventing easy sight of some of the smaller miniatures, would be somewhat more persuasive if I hadn't already encountered issues with unclaimed Omphallus hiding behind trees and ruins. Besides which, I would argue that literally hiding your troops behind a physical terrain piece is a good deal more thematic and therefore easier to reconcile than the idea that this illustration of terrain has a game effect, but that illustration of terrain does not. If you can't see behind a rock, the idea that there might be something there is a lot less alien than the idea that you can't see through something that you can actually see through, and yes, that sentence did run away from you somewhere. Besides which, if this really isn't a problem and flat symbols are sufficient, then somebody explain to me why Ymir was shipped with these 3D frost tokens, and why Jormungand is due to be shipped with 3D tidal wave tokens. Wouldn't a flat cardboard token have done the same job? Maybe I have already won this argument. Having three-dimensional terrain on the board acts as a visual reminder of these interactions and rules. Whether this is essential depends on what you mean by the term, but having pondered it over the last few months, I honestly believe that it enhances the gaming experience. So am I saying that we need physical terrain for every terrain type that blocks line of sight? Yes, absolutely I am. And let's not forget the other reason for having physical terrain. It looks amazing! Look at how much cooler our Tartarus board looks now that we've added rocks and chain barriers and three-dimensional Tartarus cages. I'm not saying this didn't cost us the money and time to achieve, but it has genuinely transformed the Tartarus map from a board I would much rather not have played on before, due to its relative complexity in terms of terrain rules, to one I can't wait to play with some more. I hope you can tell that this is the treatise of someone that truly loves the Mythic Battles game, not a declaration of war on the Monolith Overlord. In all honesty, it would be truer to describe this video as a call to arms for you, the interested player, because I do understand that the development of such terrain has a cost, and it would certainly be impractical to include detailed plastic or resin terrain covering all possible scenarios within the core box. Realistically, such terrain might need to be implemented by means of a separate expansion, and if we as players want something like that to be available, then we have to signal clearly to Monolith that this is not only something that we want, but something that enough of us are prepared to put our hands in our pockets and pay for. Sadly, we as players don't always appear to appreciate the value of such assets. Since Mythic Battles was released, there have been many other miniature board games that have offered some form of physical terrain, whether the purpose of this terrain is cited as being for the rules or for the aesthetics. I'm constantly dismayed to see comments from backers to the effect that terrain would not add much to the gameplay experience, and that characters or monsters would be better appreciated. And I think this is short-sighted, because since purchasing our rock terrain, we have used this in every game of Mythic Battles we have played, both on camera and off. In that regard, it is the most used model in our games, and has really supported teaching the game to new players and reminding us veterans to consider visibility. Perhaps on the occasions that Monolith seeks a view from our community as to what we want to see in this game system in the future, our focus should be less on new deities or heroes, and more on the sort of quality of life improvements to the game that would make it more accessible or easier to play. So what do you think? Are the issues we've experienced both on and off screen similar to your own experience, or do you find terrain symbols really easy to remember and apply? Is there a better solution than 3D terrain to this problem perhaps? I'd love to hear your views in the comments. I need to talk to people about this. I've focused my discussion in this video on game elements that interfere with line of sight because this seems to be the aspect that confuses players within my personal group. However, what about non-obstacle terrain types? Swamp terrain in particular seems to rank as the next most overlooked terrain type after the obstacles, but I'm not sure how I would go about representing this on the board, or even whether doing so would be desirable. As lovely as it would be to have fully scenic boards, this isn't always practical, and wouldn't there come a point where the board is yet again too busy, this time three-dimensionally, for players to easily identify terrain that affects them? For now, I think I would be content with obstacles being represented on the board physically, but what do you think? Thank you for joining me for this video. I hope it has been interesting and provoked thoughts that we can continue to discuss in the comments. In our next Mythic Battles video, I'm going to show you exactly how we constructed and painted our Tartarus cages, using easily available materials with absolutely no aid from Hephaestus. Soon your board will be as three-dimensional as ours and the envy of your fellow players. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss it. Until next time, work hard, play better, and take care out there.